Before I talk about the history of Northern Ireland, I just want to say briefly about the history of the island of Ireland. So the island of Ireland has had centuries long conflict and migration and all sorts of issues related to people coming in, conquering land and so on. And so the history of Northern Ireland is rooted in that. And in 1921, Northern Ireland was formed as a Protestant state on the island of Ireland for a Protestant people. Now, Northern Ireland itself has a history of migration with people coming from Scotland and elsewhere in the UK. And so this was the idea behind Northern Ireland, to have this kind of Protestant country, I guess. So it's almost 100 years since Northern Ireland has been its separate country. It remains part of the United Kingdom. And what that means is that there are people in Northern Ireland who support Northern Ireland being part of the United Kingdom, and those are typically argued to be Protestant or labelled as Protestant. And then there are people who would like Northern Ireland to reunify with the rest of the island of Ireland, just like it used to be. And those people are typically labelled as Catholics. Now, I say typically labelled because these labels, they sound religious. But they're not necessarily just religious. They also relate to political and national ideologies, particularly surrounding the constitutional state of Northern Ireland. Now, Northern Ireland itself has undergone a series of intergroup conflict. The most famous and the most pronounced is the recent Troubles. The Troubles began in the late 60s, so 68, 69, and ended in 1998 with the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. Now, Northern Ireland conflict is not known as a war because not enough people died for it to constitute a war. But with an island with a country of a population of 1.8 million and with 3,500 deaths over those years, it's quite a substantial conflict in that particular setting, and has had a bearing on relations and the setup of communities and the uses of neighbourhoods and schools, and that legacy continues today. The conflict itself has resulted in high levels of segregation in Northern Ireland, in housing and also in education. The majority of young people in Northern Ireland, noted as the Protestant or Catholic communities, attend religiously separate schools. So when you're a young person in Northern Ireland, it's unlikely that you will be educated with someone from another religious group. We do have a very small number, about 5 to 7% of children attend an integrated school, but this is still very much the minority. I think this is partly to do with the history of the conflict. There is a strong preference in Northern Ireland that parents and children have a choice to be educated with people from their own religious community, so be that Protestant or be that Catholic. And there's also a strong voice from the Catholic Church to prevent secularism in Northern Ireland. So because of that, there seems to be less of a desire to push towards integrated schooling. I think there can be positive and negative effects of separate schooling on the individual. So some might argue that faith-based schooling is really good in terms of individual safety, self-esteem, being part of the group, maybe even educational outcomes. But on the other side, that can have negative consequences for the individual. For example, your friendship networks can be highly segregated based on your faith-based groups. You may have high levels of anxiety about meeting people who are different and be more prejudiced towards different groups than what you might be if you attended more integrated level schooling. This is what I'm most interested in my research, because I think faith-based schooling is hugely problematic for the community, and that is because educating young people separately can really prevent and undermine social cohesion. So for example, we know from the research that if you're not engaging in positive interactions with people from a different group, be that religious, racial or ethnic, you're less likely to feel positive towards that group. And in a society where we have so many tensions, I think it's really problematic if we don't bring kids together to learn. From some of my research in Northern Ireland, I know that children who attend religiously separate schools do have less positive attitudes towards cohesive politics in Northern Ireland. They also tend to be more prejudiced towards different groups, have higher levels of anxiety than children who attend integrated schools, for example. I think proponents of faith-based schooling think it's a really safe space for young people with a similar cultural background to come together and learn and really immerse themselves within that community. And I think that is a strength of faith-based schooling, but it comes at a cost. And I believe that that cost is we create separate communities in societies where people should be coming together to learn about all of the different faiths or none of the faiths that we have in society. My ideal self says that we should have education systems where all children, regardless of their faith, are educated together in the same schools so that they can either have secular school systems or that children learn about all faiths as a way to understand and decide for themselves which faith it is that they want to follow. I realise that this is very idealistic, so what I would propose that we should be doing more in the short term is supporting faith-based schools to do things in the curriculum that promote social cohesion and encourage community relations. So for example, interventions that colleagues in the social psychology world or elsewhere have developed to learn children and teachers to talk about difference and to understand what difference is and what that means. So I think ideally we would have all kids together, but in the shift towards that, maybe that there are things that we can do to support teachers and children to have a better society, I think. I think it applies everywhere. So I'm doing quite a lot of work at the moment in schools in England, and one thing that I've noticed is that there is a reluctance to talk about difference and embrace difference, and I think it's hugely problematic. And you could say that the rise in faith schools hasn't helped this situation, and that we should be bringing kids together for better community relations in the UK, in any context in the world, Israel, Cyprus, the US. We know that having people together is really good for themselves, for their education, for their attitudes, and for society. I think embracing difference is really important because we know from the research that if you ignore difference, that can be really problematic for particular groups in society. So for example, if you are a minority group member, if people ignore the fact that you are that minority group member, you are a Black American or you're a British Muslim, if people ignore that, that's really detrimental to your individual self-esteem and your identity. So if people ignore that, that can be problematic. We know from the research a much better approach is to embrace and acknowledge the differences that we have and celebrate those. Integrated education in Northern Ireland is where young people from the Protestant community and young people from the Catholic community are educated together under the ethos of inclusion. The integrated school movement is really interesting because it was a grassroots parent movement of a parent group called All Children Together. And the first integrated school in Northern Ireland opened in the 1980s and it's called Lagan College. And today the integrated sector accounts for 5 to 7% of the school population, not as popular as what its advocates had hoped for. But I know from working with integrated education that they are constantly turning down places for children, so there is some desire from parents for children to attend integrated schools. I think the majority of schools in Northern Ireland are still religiously separate due to the historical nature of relations in Northern Ireland, and that means that the majority of the community want children to be educated in either their Catholic community or their Protestant community. Proponents of segregated education would argue that parents' choice is paramount and that parents should be able to choose to educate their children in that way. There is also rising concern from the Catholic Church with regards to secularism and removing the religious component from education in Northern Ireland. Bringing people together is good for community cohesion in lots of ways. And I know this because of research on something called the contact hypothesis. What the contact hypothesis states is that if you bring people together, people that don't like each other, people who are in conflict, and you do that under favourable circumstances, prejudice will reduce. Now, those favourable circumstances include things like equal status. So within the contact situation, you should be of equal status. Common goals, you should be working towards common goals. Cooperation, you should be cooperating together. And the last one is social or institutional support. And what that means is maybe if you're in a school setting, your teacher supports you to come into contact with other people, or your school, for example, has an ethos around diversity or community cohesion. And we know from the research that contact reduces prejudice amongst all sorts of different groups, religious groups, racial groups, related to age, mental health, obesity, any group that you can imagine. And it has a long history, so we know that contact works. And I know from my own research that it does other good things. So people who engage in more contact with those who are different are more likely to engage civically, so more likely to volunteer. They're also more likely to have higher educational or academic self-efficacy. So all in all, contact's good. We should have more of it. Self-efficacy I'm referring to as academic self-efficacy. So the extent to which you believe as a young person that you can achieve what you want in your academic career or in your goals. So things like, I believe I'm capable of doing my homework, of achieving what I want in my studies. My research has been motivated by a person and also a place. First of all, by a person, and this was Professor Ed Cairns. Ed Cairns was a psychologist at the University of Ulster, where I did my undergraduate degree and where I did my PhD. And in the third year of my undergraduate degree, Ed taught a unit called Peace and Conflict Psychology. And I took that unit, and through that, he really sparked my interest in issues around community cohesion, division, how to improve group relations. And I didn't realize I was ever interested in that before. So inspired by him, I applied to do a PhD with him. And from there, I have reflected on and thought about my own upbringing in Northern Ireland. So what was it like growing up in a separate community, is not meeting people from what we would say the other side, and what impact that has on all sorts of things in terms of how you interpret the history of the conflict, how you understand what the education system or the neighbourhood settings are like and should be like. So my own research has been motivated by my background in Northern Ireland and ultimately thinking about how we can make life better for future generations.